Emma's world exists in a space void of light and color, a world she describes as neither darkness nor shadow, but simply a vast, endless nothing. For her, blindness is not an absence of sight, but the presence of a complete, indifferent blankness. She has never seen shapes or colors, and has no memory of faces or landscapes. It's not like her world is cloaked in darkness. It lacks form altogether. She knows her surroundings through touch, sound, and the gentle vibrations that echo off walls, floors, and furniture, painting a map of sensations she navigates with a trained precision. With technology and careful adaptation, Emma has cultivated a life of independence. Her apartment, small but familiar, is meticulously arranged with each object in a specific place. She knows how her fingertips graze the countertop to find the sink, the delicate pattern of her fingertips against the fabric of her sofa, and the rhythmic taps of her cane on the hardwood floor, guiding her from room to room. She can almost hear the silence, broken only by subtle sounds, whispers of air when she moves, the refrigerator's hum, the creak of a window frame. It is a symphony of tiny noises that bring form to her existence. Emma's daily life outside her apartment has been crafted to function smoothly. Using a braille display for her computer and a screen reader on her phone, she can communicate with the world, answer emails, follow news, and even read for pleasure. She navigates her way to familiar places around town, each route memorized, her senses fine-tuned to subtle shifts in sound and scent that serve as landmarks in a world without visuals. People in her life marvel at her self-sufficiency, resilience, and poise in managing her surroundings. Yet a deeper solitude is woven into Emma's life, which has always lingered beneath the surface. Her independence, as empowering as it is, creates an invisible barrier, a wall that separates her from the colorful world everyone else seems to inhabit effortlessly. She is used to quiet. She welcomes it, even needs it, but it also reminds her of her isolation. There's an ever-present creeping awareness that, in this nothingness, she is uniquely alone, that she exists in a reality most cannot understand. Emma has always been cautious, almost instinctively protective of the world she's created for herself within this boundless nothing. She relies on stability, on knowing exactly where she stands. The absence of uncertainty is her anchor in a sightless world, a thin shield against the occasional, unsettling sense that something or someone might be watching. It's an irrational thought, she tells herself, a trick of the mind in an empty world, a fleeting feeling easily dismissed. And yet, she feels a faint thread of dread that winds its way through the quiet, lingering at the edge of her senses, waiting. It began as an ordinary evening, with Emma moving quietly around her apartment, her world undisturbed by anything out of place. She had just settled onto her sofa, resting her hands in her lap, when she felt it, a subtle shift in her perception, a flicker in the void. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Vision was an empty concept for her, yet now she was seeing something. She sat still, every part of her instinctively resisting the notion as if denying it would make it disappear. But it didn't vanish. It remained steady, unsettling, at the edge of her consciousness. A man stood before her. He was a figure silhouetted against her typical nothingness, a shape cutting through her blindness with a presence that made her heart race. She couldn't process it immediately. Her mind stumbled, grasping for explanations that felt just out of reach. It was impossible. She knew that. Yet here he was. Emma blinked, her mind running through the logical steps. Perhaps this was some anomaly, a fleeting trick her mind was playing on her, a hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and opened them again, waiting for her reality to reassert itself. But he was still there, as present as her familiar surroundings, and she could see him. The man seemed out of place in her world, like a character from a dream imposed on reality. He was tall, slender, and dressed in what appeared to be a suit, indeterminate, either a deep gray or black, though even the notion of color was foreign to her. His face was pale, with angular features softened only by a smile that was too polite, almost smug, and his eyes weren't directly looking at her, but rather staring off somewhere as if he were deep in thought. Yet, his stance made her feel he knew she was watching. Emma's mind raced, filling with questions she couldn't answer. How was this possible? Was she finally losing her grip on reality, her years of navigating the nothingness around her taking a toll on her mind? She reached up, pressing her fingertips against her temples to reassure herself that she was anchored. But the man remained fixed in her vision, unmoving, unfazed by her reaction. As she continued staring, she tried to examine him more closely, desperate to find some clue to explain this absurd reality. He was immaculately dressed, his suit pressed and neat, with a hat perched on his head that cast a faint shadow over his face. His hair was dark, though she couldn't tell its exact shade, and his lips were drawn into that same strange, knowing smile. His posture was relaxed, too casual for someone invading her world, as if he belonged there more than she did. He seemed like an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't solve, and her mind refused to accept his existence. Then, slowly, he turned his head. It was a subtle movement, but it made her heart skip a beat. He looked directly at her, his eyes locking onto hers with a calm, unsettling familiarity. His gaze held a strange intensity, as though he could see straight through her, reading her innermost thoughts. And then, without warning, he winked. The gesture was so ordinary, so absurdly human, that it sent a shiver down her spine. The visible man, she instinctively gave him this name in her mind, did not belong in her world, yet here he was, acknowledging her, making contact as if he knew her. Emma's fingers gripped the edge of the sofa, her knuckles white, her entire body tense with a fear she couldn't explain. She watched as he turned away, stepping back into the emptiness surrounding him. But he didn't vanish. Instead, he walked away slowly, his form shrinking in the distance, his figure becoming smaller and smaller until he was a mere speck on the horizon of her vision. It was as if he were slipping back into the nothingness from which he'd emerged, leaving her alone again, yet forever changed. Emma sat breathless, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Had she imagined it? Her mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps he was a hallucination, a figment conjured by her loneliness or suppressed fears. She had read about the brain filling in gaps when deprived of sensory input. Was this some manifestation of her isolation, an unconscious yearning for connection twisted into a haunting specter? But no matter how many explanations she tried to muster, the image of the man persisted in her mind. Every detail, the smoothness of his skin, the curl of his smile, the flicker of his wink, felt too vivid, too real to dismiss. She thought he had truly been there, as if he had stepped into her world deliberately, not as a random hallucination, but as something intentional, targeted. Hours passed before Emma was finally moved from her spot, her body aching from the tension she'd been holding on to. She found her way to her bedroom, the familiar routine of touch and memory grounding her, soothing the lingering unease. But sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him again, his face lingering in her mind, his knowing smile etched into her memory. She lay awake, haunted by the image, the silence around her now a sinister reminder of the encounter. In the days that followed, Emma glanced around constantly, half expecting to see him lurking at the edges of her perception. Every quiet moment felt charged with anticipation, as if he were waiting, watching her from afar, ready to reappear at any moment. She told herself it was ridiculous, that he was a product of her imagination. And yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was real, that he was still out there in the nothingness, observing her from a place just beyond her reach. Her carefully cultivated world of silence and certainty felt disrupted, like a crack had formed, letting in something foreign and dark. The routines that once brought her comfort now felt hollow, the familiar spaces around her tainted by the memory of the man. She began questioning everything, her senses betraying her as she strained to detect any hint of his presence. Was that a faint creak of a floorboard? A whisper of fabric brushing against the air? Or was it her mind conjuring him up from her imagination? Emma felt vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. She was used to navigating a world without sight, but now, for the first time, she felt truly exposed. This man, this figure who should not have existed, had entered her world without warning, leaving her with a lingering sense of dread. She knew nothing about him, not his name, purpose, or reason for choosing her. And as days turned into weeks, she began to fear that her encounter with the visible man was only the beginning, a dark prelude to something far more terrifying than she could comprehend. This fear stayed with her, a shadow that followed her through each day and night, transforming her life of quiet independence into one of tense uncertainty. Emma had spent years mastering her own blindness, but now she felt as though the nothingness she had once accepted had betrayed her, hiding within it a stranger who held the power to unravel everything she thought she knew. Days passed, but the memory of that night didn't fade. It grew sharper, more intrusive. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking just beyond her perception's boundaries, hidden within the nothingness she'd once found so familiar. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination. The visible man was a trick of the mind, a flash of fear conjured by fatigue or stress. Yet, each time she reassured herself, she would catch a fleeting glimpse of him again, always distant, never close, but unmistakably there. Emma would feel him before she saw him. There was a shift in her awareness, like a faint ripple breaking the surface of still water. Then, out of that ripple, he would appear, standing far away but visible. No matter where she was, he seemed able to find her, his figure blending into the formless void that filled her vision. Sometimes she'd see him sitting at her desk, at other times from her apartment window, and once even in the reflection of a storefront as she passed by. He would be there, silent and unmoving, watching her from afar. It was as if he were tethered to her, a shadow she couldn't escape. Her attempts to understand this presence became obsessive. She spent hours online, searching through forums and community threads, hoping anyone had experienced something similar. She scoured Reddit threads for the blind, read articles on visual hallucinations, and even posted anonymously in communities for paranormal experiences. She wrote out her experience carefully each time, but the responses were either dismissive or downright mocking. Some users suggested it was a coping mechanism, her brain's attempt to fill the void. Others told her it was just a hallucination brought on by isolation or stress. A few laughed at her, assuming it was a poorly written horror story. Her frustration grew, along with a gnawing fear that she might truly be losing her mind. Still, Emma couldn't let it go. Every time she felt the man's presence, her heart would pound, and she'd be reminded that he was real, at least as real as anything else. She began recording her sightings, jotting down details in a notebook to track patterns, hoping something would make sense. But there was no logic to his appearances. Sometimes days would pass without a sighting, and then he'd appear several times within a single afternoon, as if intentionally playing with her sense of security. She would note his posture, expression, even the tilt of his hat, but nothing changed. He never spoke or moved toward her, yet his presence loomed over her life, imbuing it with a constant, nagging dread. Over time, Emma's sense of paranoia deepened. She began questioning every part of her routine, wondering if the man was narrating her life from a distance. She changed her usual walking routes, avoided the places where she'd seen him before, and even rearranged the furniture in her apartment to make herself feel safer. But none of it helped. The visible man remained unwavering and patient, a distant figure who seemed to feed off her fear. One day, a particularly quiet Sunday morning, she felt his gaze more intensely than ever. She had been sitting at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee, trying to shake the restless night's sleep from her mind. The apartment was silent, her world filled only by the rhythmic clink of her spoon against the cup. Then, a cold shiver passed over her, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She knew, even before she looked up, that he was there. And there he was, standing across the street from her building, his figure sharp against the blur of her usual vision. This time, his expression was different. His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile that seemed to stretch beyond human limits. Her heart thundered as she realized he was closer than he'd ever been before. She could almost see the lines on his face, the intensity in his eyes. A small, dark part of her wondered if he could see into her soul, peeling back layers she hadn't even known she had. Emma's fear became a constant companion, eroding her once steady resolve. She began to fear her reflection, afraid he might be looking back at her from some shadowy corner she couldn't see. Every sound in her apartment became a potential threat, every silence a canvas for her growing terror. She rarely left home anymore, and when she did, it was with her heart pounding, her senses stretched thin, scanning the edges of her perception for any sign of him. Her attempts to explain him, to fit him into some rational framework, only made her anxiety worse. Each failed explanation chipped away at her sanity, leaving her more vulnerable and isolated. She couldn't confide in anyone. After all, who would believe that she, a blind woman, was seeing a man who shouldn't exist? Concerned by her sudden change in demeanor, her friends reached out to her, inviting her out and offering help, but Emma could barely respond. Every time she tried to explain, the words sounded hollow, like echoes of a nightmare no one else could understand. The line between reality and illusion began to blur. There were days when she doubted her memories, wondering if she'd fabricated the man entirely, a phantom born from her loneliness and fear. But then she would catch sight of him, and all doubts would vanish, replaced by the same overwhelming dread. She could feel him watching her, a constant, silent observer who seemed to derive some twisted pleasure from her torment. One night, unable to sleep, she sat by her window, staring into the darkness beyond. Her fingers trembled as she reached up, touching the cool glass, as if trying to bridge the distance between herself and the shadowy figure that haunted her thoughts. She whispered to herself, "What do you want from me?" The words hung in the air, unanswered, met only by silence. But in her heart, Emma knew no answer would satisfy her. This man, this specter, wasn't something she could reason with or understand. He existed beyond the reach of logic, a dark figure born from the unknown recesses of her mind, or something far more sinister. And as she sat there, staring into the empty night, she felt the walls of her world closing in, the nothingness around her growing colder, sharper, as if even her blindness could no longer shield her from the visible man's relentless gaze. Emma felt herself spiraling, trapped in a cage of her own making. She could almost feel his gaze now, lingering at the edges of her perception, a constant reminder that she was never truly alone. She felt his presence looming over her every day, every moment, an invisible hand guiding her every step, whispering into the darkness surrounding her. And as her fear deepened, Emma began to wonder if the visible man would ever leave, or if she would remain forever trapped in his shadow, an unwilling participant in a game she didn't understand. Emma had hoped, in the deepest corners of her mind, that she was losing her grip on reality. She clung to the hope that the visible man was a hallucination, a terrible fragment of her imagination, something that would disappear if she ignored it long enough. But on that day, as she sat in the break room at her office building, gazing out the large windows, her last shred of denial shattered. The day began like any other. She was going through her routine, her carefully orchestrated series of steps that kept her grounded as she moved from her desk to the small kitchenette. She reached for her mug, savoring the warmth of the coffee between her hands, but then she felt it. That familiar, icy shiver trickling down her spine. She knew he was there, outside, somewhere in the distance, as constant as her shadow. Her heart thumped in her chest, and her pulse quickened as she tried to block out the thought, to stay focused on her coffee, her work, her controlled little world. But something drew her gaze toward the window as if his presence had a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. And there, far below on the street, she saw him. In his dark suit, the visible man was strolling down the sidewalk, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. She tensed, watching him with a mixture of dread and fascination, her fingers gripping the edge of the countertop to steady herself. His expression was calm, indifferent, as he moved fluidly through the crowd like a ghost among the living. Then, Emma noticed someone else, an older man standing a few paces ahead, unaware of the figure approaching from behind. This man stood out, wearing a brightly colored shirt, his posture relaxed as he took a drag from a cigarette. Even from her vantage point, she could see the casual way he tilted his head back to exhale a plume of smoke. There was a warmth, a humanity to this figure that contrasted starkly with the cold, eerie presence of the visible man. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched the visible man draw closer, his steps slow, deliberate. The crowd around them seemed oblivious, people bustling by without a second glance. And then, with a sudden, almost graceful movement, he was upon the man. Emma's eyes widened, and her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp as she saw him reach out, his fingers curling around the man's shoulder. The moment stretched out, suspended in the air, and Emma felt a rising dread, a visceral pull in her stomach urging her to look away. But she couldn't. It happened so quickly, yet every detail slowed to a horrible clarity in her mind. The visible man's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the man's shoulder with a force that belied his calm exterior. With a sudden, brutal twist, he wrenched the man's head to the side, and Emma thought she could almost hear the sickening crack of bone, even from stories above. Her stomach lurched, bile rising in her throat as the scene unfolded before her, an incomprehensible tableau of violence. The man's cigarette fell from his lips, his body stiffening in shock and pain. For a moment he struggled, his hands flailing weakly against the iron grip of his assailant, but it was futile. Emma watched, horrified, as the visible man tightened his hold, his fingers sinking into the flesh with an almost inhuman force. She could feel the terror coursing through her own body, a mirror of the victim's helplessness, his desperate, silent plea for escape. The visible man's face remained expressionless, disturbingly calm as he continued his assault. His movements were precise, mechanical, each motion somehow both detached and chillingly intentional. Emma watched in horrified disbelief as his grip tightened, until a sickening sound cracked through the air, a sound that echoed deep in her mind. Her stomach twisted, her hands clenched, nails pressing into her palms as she forced herself to stay silent, hidden in the shadows. Every part of her screamed to shout, to run, to do something, but she was frozen, ensnared by terror. As the man he held slumped forward, his body limp and lifeless, the visible man continued, unfazed, as though finishing an unpleasant task. Blood smeared the pavement, dark and startling, staining the suit he wore and marking the ground beneath him. Emma could feel the cold grip of fear wrapping around her, paralyzing her, her breaths shallow and frantic as she tried to process the reality unfolding before her. The air seemed to close in, thick and heavy, pressing down on her as she struggled against the overwhelming horror threatening to consume her mind. This couldn't be real, some twisted hallucination, some trick of her mind. But then, as she fought against her disbelief, he looked up. Their eyes met, and a shiver like ice ran through her. His face, flecked with blood, remained serene, but his lips curled into a smile too wide, too knowing, like he had seen her from the very beginning. His eyes held hers with a dark satisfaction, as though he took pleasure in her terror, as if he knew she was watching. Emma felt exposed, her vulnerability laid bare before him, as if he were reaching across the distance, stripping her of every defense she had. Emma's hands trembled, her vision blurring with tears. She wanted to turn away, to tear herself from his gaze, but she couldn't move, trapped in his eyes. It was as though he had reached through the shadows, wrapping an invisible grip around her heart, squeezing until she could barely breathe. A soft sound broke her trance, a presence behind her, a gentle hand on her shoulder. Emma jumped, her mind snapping back to her surroundings. It was Susan, her friend. Concern etched across her face as she asked, "Emma, what's wrong?" Emma tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, the horror of what she'd witnessed still strangling her voice. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, she managed, He killed someone." Susan's face grew pale, her hand gripping Emma's shoulder tightly as she looked out the window. But the street below was quiet, people moving about as if nothing had happened, no trace of the horror Emma had seen. The visible man had vanished, leaving the scene as ordinary as ever, untouched by the nightmare that had shaken Emma to her core. "Emma, there's no one there," Susan murmured softly, worry lacing her tone. But her words barely registered. Emma's mind was consumed by the image of that blood-stained smile, those eyes that had seemed to see right into her. She knew she could never forget it, that he was burned into her mind, haunting her even now, a shadow lurking in every corner of her thoughts. Her legs gave out, and she sank into a chair, her whole body shaking as the weight of what she had seen settled over her. She couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but one truth gnawed at her, undeniable and terrifying. The visible man was real, capable of horrors beyond comprehension. And, worst of all, she feared, with a dreadful certainty, that he was coming for her. The days following the murder passed in a haze, a dark blur of fear and disbelief that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Emma found herself retreating into her apartment, her sanctuary, now transformed into a prison. She had seen something no one else could see, something she couldn't even explain, and the horror of it clung to her like a shadow. Every corner, every quiet creak of her floorboards, every muffled hum of the city outside felt charged with the lingering presence of the Visible Man. She had come face to face with him, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he hadn't finished with her. Emma's world became smaller. Sighed. She avoided going outside. The streets and public spaces she had once navigated so confidently now felt too exposed, too dangerous. Even walking to the door felt like a risk. If he could follow her, find her wherever she went, staying inside was her only defense. She kept her curtains drawn, every glimpse outside feeling like an invitation for him to step into her life. Her breaths grew shallow as the hours stretched on, each second ticking louder than the last. The isolation closed in around her, squeezing her chest with a growing sense of dread. At first, she thought she might find answers if she looked hard enough. She turned to online forums, blind communities, paranormal message boards, anywhere someone might listen. She typed out her story carefully, every word chosen to capture the horror of what she had seen, but her posts were met with skepticism and disbelief. Strangers on the internet labeled her as disturbed or attention-seeking, a blind woman fabricating stories to feel special. The worst were those who laughed at her, telling her it was impossible for her to see anything. No one believed her. No one could see the truth. Desperation drove her to reach out to her friends, those she had previously relied on for support and reassurance. But each conversation, each attempt to explain what was happening, only brought new waves of frustration and helplessness. Her friends' responses were variations of the same theme. Maybe you're under too much stress, Emma, or maybe it's just a bad dream that feels real. Even Susan, the only one who had caught a glimpse of her terror after the murder, that gently tried to convince her that it was all in her head. Each well-meaning suggestion felt like a slap, dismissing her fear as a figment of her imagination. Every rejection, every doubt cast by those she trusted added to her growing paranoia. The Visible Man was real, and he was out there. She could feel him lurking in the edges of her perception, watching her every move, waiting. The isolation became unbearable, an oppressive weight pressing down on her, leaving her feeling small and powerless. Her thoughts grew darker, more frantic, as she tried to make sense of her tormentor. Who was he? Why had he chosen her? What did he want? One sleepless night, as she sat curled up on her sofa, Emma obsessed over every detail she could remember. She clung to her memory of his face, eyes, and smile, details that shouldn't exist for someone who had never seen a face before. It was as if he had imprinted himself onto her mind, burned into her consciousness in a way that defied reason. She wondered if he was something more than human, a specter who had slipped into her world from some dark place, drawn to her by her blindness and the emptiness surrounding her. But even these thoughts gave her no comfort. If he was a figment, a hallucination, she could seek help. She could try to make him disappear. But he felt real, too real. And the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that he had chosen her deliberately, as though her blindness made her uniquely vulnerable to his presence. She had become his prey, his captive audience, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Emma's paranoia grew to the point where she began to sense him, not in any tangible way, but as a presence lurking just beyond her reach, like a quiet, malevolent hum that filled the silence of her apartment. She could feel him in her bones, a crawling, prickling sensation that never seemed to leave her. Her skin tingled whenever she thought about him, a visceral reminder that he was always close, even if she couldn't see him in the moment. She began staying awake late into the night, terrified he might invade her dreams if she closed her eyes. She sat up with her back pressed against the wall, her senses sharpened, straining to catch even the faintest hint of him. Her hands shook, her breathing shallow as she listened to every creak, every whisper of sound in the dark. Hours stretched endlessly, each minute feeding her fear, each second reinforcing the dreadful certainty he would come for her. It was only a matter of time. One evening, as she huddled in the suffocating silence, Emma's phone buzzed. A single message breaking through her isolation. It was from Susan, checking in after noticing her absence at work. "Emma, are you okay?" the message read. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a brief moment she considered pouring everything out, begging Susan to come, to save her from this nightmare. But the words felt hollow, empty. No one could understand. No one could save her from this. She was truly, desperately alone. With a heavy heart, she typed a simple reply, "I'm fine, just taking some time." The words felt like a lie, deepening her sense of isolation. She set the phone aside, feeling a wave of exhaustion settle over her. She wanted to cry, to scream, to do anything to break the stifling silence. But she was trapped, ensnared in the grip of her own fear, a prisoner to the figure that haunted her every waking moment. The days blurred together, a relentless loop of dread and waiting. Emma marked time by his appearances, each closer, each lingering longer than the last. He was closing in on her, step by deliberate step, and she could feel his dark anticipation, his twisted pleasure as he toyed with her, feeding off her fear. She was his captive, his chosen target, and the inevitability of her fate hung over her like a shadow, a weight pressing down on her chest. As her mind spiraled further into paranoia, Emma began to prepare for the end. She locked her doors, bolted her windows, and stacked barricades against every entrance. But she knew, deep down, that it was futile. Locks and walls wouldn't stop him. He would find her no matter what shall was wait. Bracing herself for the moment he would cross that final threshold, stepping fully into her world to deliver the fate she felt in her bones. In a final act of desperation, Emma turned to her notebook, pouring out her fear, her horror, her helplessness in a frantic stream of words. Her hands trembled as she wrote, each line a record of the nightmare that consumed her, a plea for someone, anyone, to understand. Her heart raced as she finished, but the familiar sensation washed over her. A cold shiver as the darkness pressed closer, as though his presence had seeped through the walls. She didn't need to look to know he was there, watching from somewhere in the shadows. A chill crept down her spine as a horrifying certainty took hold of her mind. He was coming for her, and there was nowhere left to run. Emma hesitated before reaching out to Susan. She had rehearsed the conversation 1,000 times in her head, but each time the words felt too fragmented, too unbelievable. She feared Susan's reaction. Would she be dismissed, called delusional, or met with that same look of pity and confusion everyone else seemed to give her? But the isolation had become unbearable, and the weight of her fear was too much to carry alone. If there was anyone she could trust, it was Susan. When Susan arrived at her apartment that evening, Emma was already perched on the edge of her sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the tension. Susan's familiar footsteps and soft voice brought an immediate wave of comfort, easing Emma's tightly wound nerves. She felt her muscles loosen slightly as Susan entered the room, setting down her bag and giving her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "Emma," Susan began, concern laced in her tone. "You sounded so serious on the phone. What's going on?" Emma took a shaky breath, her throat tight as she searched for the right words. She looked in Susan's direction, grounding herself in the presence of the one person she could confide in, even if she couldn't fully understand. I've been seeing someone, Susan," she began in a quiet, vulnerable whisper. She paused, choosing her words carefully, but the fear still seeped through. Not like that. It's this man. I keep seeing him no matter where I go. He's always there, watching me." Susan's face softened with concern, though confusion flickered across her features. "Emma, what do you mean? How can you see him?" Emma bit her lip, fighting the familiar frustration rising in her chest. "I know it sounds impossible, but he's real, Susan. I can see him. I don't know how, but he's there, always standing close enough that I can feel his eyes on me." Susan was silent, and Emma sensed the doubt she held back. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to go on, recounting the sightings, the silent stares, the unsettling smile, and the terrible scene she had witnessed. Every word carried the helpless terror that had haunted her for weeks. As she spoke, her voice wavered, and tears threatened to spill. Her mind raced, fearing she sounded mad, that Susan would stand up and leave her alone in this dark nightmare. But Susan didn't leave. She sat beside Emma, listening intently, her face softening as Emma's words grew more frantic. By the time Emma had finished, Susan was quiet, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and empathy. She gently touched Emma's shoulder, her hand warm and grounding. "Oh, Emma," Susan murmured, a sigh escaping her. I don't fully understand, but I can see this is tearing you apart. You believe this, don't you?" Emma nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her at the simple acceptance in Susan's voice. She could still hear the doubt, the unspoken questions beneath Susan's words, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Susan was there, listening, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't facing this horror alone. Susan stayed for hours, her presence a balm against the fear that had taken root in Emma's mind. They drank tea together, the warmth of the cups soothing her trembling hands. They spoke softly, Susan's voice steady and calm as she offered gentle reassurances and practical suggestions. She reminded Emma that she wasn't alone, that she could reach out whenever needed, and that there were people who truly cared about her. Emma allowed herself to believe it, just for those few hours, letting the comfort of her friend's presence ease the gnawing dread that had haunted her every waking moment. With Susan beside her, the apartment felt brighter, safer. Even the shadows seemed less menacing. She managed a small laugh, fragile and hesitant, as they reminisced over old memories and shared quiet moments of nostalgia. The familiar routines of friendship, the tea, the laughter, the comforting words, wrapped around Emma like a protective cloak, and for the first time in days, the relentless fear loosened its grip. She could almost believe that everything would be okay, that this nightmare would pass, and that she would return to the life she once knew. She clung to that feeling, savoring the fleeting sense of normalcy and the warmth of human connection, which made the darkness seem less suffocating. As evening deepened, Emma felt herself grow weary, her body and mind finally relaxing after days of unrelenting tension. She offered Susan the bed, but Susan insisted on staying with her in the living room, a quiet promise that she would be there, watching over her as she slept. Emma's eyes grew heavy, her fear dulled by exhaustion and the steady, comforting rhythm of Susan's breathing beside her. She sank into the sofa, letting her guard down, allowing herself to drift into sleep, a fragile hope flickering within her. But as Emma closed her eyes, she couldn't entirely shake the lingering presence of the visible man. He felt distant now, pushed to the edges of her mind, but he was still there, like a dark stain she couldn't wash away. She could feel his eyes on her, watching through the walls of her apartment, waiting, his patient smile etched into her memory. She tried to tell herself it was just paranoia, a shadow of fear that would fade with time. Yet, even as she slipped into uneasy dreams, Emma sensed the truth. The visible man was still there, lurking just beyond her reach, waiting for her guard to drop, waiting for the borrowed safety of Susan's presence to vanish. And she knew, in the quiet recesses of her mind, that he wouldn't stop until he was beside her once again. The day began like any other, but it carried an uneasy undercurrent for Emma, a feeling she couldn't shake. Susan had promised to stop by after work, and her reassuring presence was a fragile lifeline Emma clung to as she struggled to keep her fears at bay. Faintly, she had started to believe that Susan's friendship might somehow protect her from the relentless terror of the visible man. Susan was her connection to the real world, a tangible force that grounded her and made her feel almost safe. But the feeling didn't last. It was late afternoon when Emma felt that familiar, icy dread trickling down her spine, a suspicion that settled like a weight in her chest. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination, a lingering effect of too many sleepless nights. But the feeling only grew, an insistent pressure gnawing at her nerves. And then she sensed him. The realization hit her like a punch. The visible man was back. Emma's mind whirled in panic as she felt for her phone, her trembling fingers searching for Susan's name. She dialed, but her hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the device. The ringing filled her ears, a taunting reminder of the seconds ticking by as her fear mounted. Finally, Susan picked up. "Emma?" Susan's voice was calm, unaware of the storm brewing on the other end of the line. "Hey, I'm just around the corner. I picked up some takeout. I'll be there soon, okay?" But Emma's voice wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, her mouth dry as she tried to speak, tried to warn Susan, but the words felt stuck, as if something were pressing down on her chest, silencing her. She could only manage a faint, choked whisper. "Susan, don't." "What, Emma, are you okay?" Before Emma could reply, she felt him, the dark presence growing closer, and her heart lurched as the truth dawned on her. He was coming for Susan. Desperation surged through her, and she forced herself to speak, her voice strained with panic. "Susan, please. You have to get out of there. Turn around. Don't come here. He's there, Susan. Please, don't." But it was too late. Emma sensed it. a terrible certainty that sliced through her. The visible man was with her friend, his presence darkening the edges of her awareness. She gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding as she listened to the confusion in Susan's voice, a confusion that quickly turned to a startled gasp, then silence. Then she saw him in her mind, a vision that felt almost real. The visible man stood mere inches from Susan, his face set in that same unsettling smile. He reached out, his fingers curling around her shoulder with a gentleness that belied the terror to come. Emma could almost hear his breathing, the soft hum of satisfaction as he loomed over her friend. "No," Emma screamed, her voice breaking. She clutched the phone, her knuckles white as she listened helplessly, Susan's faint, confused voice dissolving into horror. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a frenzy of fear and despair, but she could do nothing. She was trapped, separated from her friend by an invisible barrier she couldn't break, powerless to stop the nightmare unfolding before her. The sounds that followed were ones she would never forget. She heard Susan's sharp, terrified intake of breath, followed by a muffled struggle, a thud, and a gasping sob. In her mind's eye, Emma could see it all with horrifying clarity, every detail etched into her memory as though she were right there, witnessing it herself. The visible man's hands around Susan's throat, his grip tightening as he lifted her off her feet, her legs kicking, her hands clawing at his arms in a futile attempt to break free. Emma's breathing grew ragged, mirroring the desperate gasps she imagined from Susan, the agony, the helplessness. Her mind conjured the scene in brutal detail. Susan's face growing pale, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream as the visible man's grip crushed the life from her. Emma could hear every ragged breath, every muffled sound of Susan's struggle, a symphony of horror that filled the silence of her apartment, each second stretching into eternity. "Please, please stop," Emma whispered, the words spilling from her in a hoarse, broken sob. But there was no one to hear her. Her plea dissolved into the emptiness, swallowed up by the cold reality of her isolation. She could only sit there, paralyzed, her entire body shaking, her heart shattered as she listened helplessly to the brutal, final moments of her friend's life. In the stillness that followed, a deep, suffocating guilt seeped into her, twisting her insides until she thought she might be sick. She should have done something. She should have saved her. She had failed, and now Susan was gone, her life snuffed out by the same darkness that haunted Emma's every waking moment. The weight of it was crushing, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. As her mind reeled, she felt his gaze shift, that familiar, chilling presence returning like a cold hand brushing against her skin. She knew, without a doubt, that he was watching her, that he had seen her despair, her helplessness, and that he took pleasure in it. She could almost see him standing in the shadows, his blood-stained hands still clenched, his twisted smile fixed upon her. And in that moment, Emma broke, her mind shattered under the weight of her grief and terror, a primal scream tearing from her lips as she collapsed to the floor, her hands clawing at her face, as if to tear away the image of the visible man. She sobbed uncontrollably, her voice hoarse, her body racked with tremors as the realization set in. She was alone. Utterly, devastatingly alone. No one would believe her. No one would save her. The only person who had tried to understand was gone, taken from her in the most brutal, unimaginable way. The room around her felt like a prison, its walls closing in, suffocating her, trapping her in a cage of despair. Her thoughts spiraled into darkness, consumed by images of Susan's last moments, the terror in her friend's eyes, and the final, desperate plea for life that had gone unanswered. It replayed repeatedly in her mind, a loop of horror she couldn't escape. Emma's body felt hollow, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of her guilt and fear. She lay curled on the floor, numb, her mind drifting in and out of a haze. She couldn't tell where she ended, and the darkness began, the two merging until they were one, a void of hopelessness that swallowed her whole. She was no longer Emma. She was a shadow, a shell, a vessel for the horror that had taken over her life. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, a small, flickering thought surfaced, a dark whisper that sent a chill down her spine. She knew that she was next. The visible man had claimed Susan, and now he would come for her, his shadow growing closer with each passing second. There was no escaping him, no way out. She could lock her doors and hide in the furthest corners of her apartment, but It wouldn't matter. He would find her just as he had found Susan, and when he did, there would be no one left to hear her scream. As she lay there, her mind fractured and broken, Emma felt a strange, hollow acceptance settle over her. She no longer cared. She was too tired, too weary to fight. If he wanted her, he could have her. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose. Her world had been reduced to ashes, her hope extinguished in a blaze of horror and despair. And so she waited, listening to the silence, her breath shallow, her heart a faint, hollow beat in the darkness. She knew he was coming, and when he arrived, she would greet him with open arms, welcoming the end he promised, the oblivion that would finally free her from this nightmare. In that final moment, as she lay engulfed by despair, Emma felt a bitter peace settle over her, the faintest whisper of relief in the knowledge that it would all be over soon. Emma felt it deep in her bones, the cold, creeping certainty that her time was running out. She was next. The air in her apartment felt thick, suffocating, and every shadow seemed to pulse with a silent, menacing promise. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, fingers numb and clumsy, slipping over the screen. She dialed the emergency number, praying someone would pick up, hear, and believe her. The dial tone droned in her ear, each ring stretching endlessly, mocking her desperation. She could barely breathe, her chest tight with panic as if the walls were closing in. Finally, a voice answered, calm and detached. A lifeline she couldn't afford to lose. "Please," she gasped, her voice thin and ragged. "You have to help me. He's coming. He killed my friend, and now he's coming for me. Please." There was a pause on the other end, filled only with her shallow, desperate breaths. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and tell me where you are. Who is coming for you?" Emma tried to answer, but the words died in her throat. How could she explain this nightmare? How could she make them understand? She felt the cold prickling at the edges of her senses, a familiar, malevolent presence inching closer. She turned, eyes wide, heart pounding, and there he was, the visible man, standing in the corner of her living room, his figure sharper, more solid than ever before. Her breath hitched, and the phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor as she took a shaky step back. His eyes met hers, and he smiled, a slow, twisted smile that sent a wave of terror crashing over her. He stepped forward, his polished shoes tapping softly on the floor, each step echoing in the silence. "No, no, please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt frozen, her body paralyzed by fear as he advanced, his gaze never leaving hers. Her mind screamed to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but her body wouldn't obey. She was trapped, held captive by his gaze, by the dark satisfaction glinting in his eyes. In a final, desperate act, she dropped to her knees, scrambling for the phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to find the call. "Please," she begged into the silence, unsure if anyone was still on the line. "He's here. Please help me." But there was no response, only thick, unrelenting silence as the air grew colder, darker. She looked up, tears streaming down her face, to see the visible man standing over her, his smile widening. His hand reached out, stretching toward her, fingers pale and cold as ice, closing the last inch of distance between them. Emma's voice broke in a final hopeless cry as his fingers brushed her skin, chilling her to the bone. And then, darkness, absolute and consuming, wrapped around her. The line went dead, leaving only the quiet hum of an empty room filled with shadows and silence as the world faded to black.